Good evening, all. My name is Moyra Samuels. I am a local resident of North Kensington, live 300 metres from the Grenfell Tower, and have been for the last 3 years a Grenfell campaigner. I will be chairing tonight's meeting, and we have an array of excellent speakers tonight. Homes for All is a grassroots alliance of private renters, council and housing associations, tenants, trade unions, and housing campaigners. We're all working with each other to stop the avalanche of evictions and homelessness that is threatening England and Wales. In Scotland, the Assembly has agreed to extend till 2021 the ban on evictions. But this meeting is about how we can step up pressure on the government to extend the ban on evictions, currently due to be lifted on the 20th of September. Together, we won the ban and 2 previous extensions. With the big issue, with Generation Rent, with tenants unions, trade unions and others, we need to work out what we can do to hold the government to their promise that in March 2020, that no one will lose their home due to the pandemic. I will introduce all of our speakers individually. Each speaker will be speaking for 3 to 4 minutes. And I will ask people who are listening to this event, if they could raise any questions, they can put it into the chat, and I will actually ask the speakers to respond to those questions. Please feel free to put in those questions as you listen to our speakers. So our first speaker tonight is Alicia Kennedy, who's the director of Generation Rent, a campaigning organisation for private renters. Welcome, Alicia.
Thank you. Thank you, Moyra, and welcome everyone. Every day at Generation Rent, we are contacted by people with serious rent debt because of the pandemic. Their stories are heartbreaking. Many have lived in their properties for years and are now being asked to leave. Families who have children at local schools find it hard and find themselves priced out of an area they call home. This week, we spoke to a man who is literally choosing between feeding his kids or paying his rent. I'm scared for them. We're all scared for him on this call. And we're scared for thousands of other renters like them who have racked up rent debt due to no fault of their own. Generation Rent research has shown that 1 in 5 private renters who have struggled to pay rent during the pandemic have already been told to move out, been given a rent increase, or been threatened with eviction. It's just an absolute disgrace. And of course, if you've lost your job or some of your income and you either aren't eligible for benefits or you get your benefit and find it doesn't even cover the rent that you owe, how are you going to afford to move? You can't afford the deposit. You can't find a landlord to give you a break. Where do you go? How do you live? If the government fails to step in and intervene to deal with this rent debt crisis, which so far they have failed to do, homelessness is the only option for thousands and thousands of renters. The government talks about the new 6-month notice period that took effect in April. And yes, it will help some. But our analysis of YouGov research estimates at least 55,000 private renters have been told to leave before that notice took effect, and therefore could be taken to court once the ban lifts on Monday. This new notice period is absolutely no help whatsoever for them. So what the government has to do is put in place mechanisms, because what they've done so far is just not good enough. The ban needs to stay in place until a plan is in place to deal with rent debt. We need grants for those who can't pay. We need benefits raised to cover rent. We need the benefit cap lifted. We need emergency legislation to make mandatory grounds for eviction discretionary. We need an end to Section 21. The government promised this, and if ever there was a time to end Section 21, now is that time. Homelessness destroys lives, And Generation Rent, with Homes for All and all the speakers tonight, will continue to make these arguments and fight to stop private renters, and hope that again, like they did last time, the government will act in the 11th hour to not lift the ban on Sunday night. I welcome your questions, and thank you for giving me the opportunity tonight, Moyra, to speak to you all.
Thank you so much, Alicia. You've certainly raised some very key issues for many that I think many of the private renters are facing. Our next speaker is Louise, if she's here, if Louise is here. Is Louise here? If Louise is not here, if I could take Ian Hodson, who is of the Bakers Union, and he represents thousands of low-paid workers in the food industry. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you very much, and obviously thank you very much for the invitation. I think, you know, the housing issue is probably before the pandemic, during the pandemic, and after the pandemic, the biggest issue that working class communities face. You know, I mean, what was really interesting at the start of the pandemic, of course, was that we solved the homelessness crisis by making sure we took everybody off the street. So it just goes to show, if there's a will, there is the ability to make sure that people don't have to live on the streets. And I think, you know, we should bear that in mind when we see, you know, our streets filling up again with people. You know, these are political decisions and these are political choices. Obviously, you know, as somebody who works for a trade union and who represents working people who have majority worked through this pandemic, you know, we've been quite well protected, because obviously as food has been on the increase, obviously, you know, it has meant more hours for people to work. But obviously we've had a large swathe of people in our trade union that has had to go on statutory sick pay. I mean, last week we launched a campaign around statutory sick pay, where people are being asked to survive on £95 and 85 pence a week, or equivalent to £13.70 a day, and then they're faced with a choice: do they go into work and risk losing their home, or, you know, not being able to put food on the table? I mean, so it's quite a stark choice that people have to make, and that should never be a position that anybody finds themselves being in. I mean, there's quite a number of issues that need tackling in this country, and I noticed David Cameron this morning was saying that austerity prepared us for COVID. Obviously for his family and those well off maybe, but obviously not for those people who were trying to survive on a low income. They certainly aren't prepared, and they certainly weren't able to save money for a rainy day. But I think it's absolutely right that the call to stop the government changing the law on Sunday and allowing evictions to take place, it has to be halted. And I think the trade union movement needs to be involved in that. I think it's important that trade unions recognise the role that we play in supporting people who are facing evictions as well. I think, you know, the support that the FBU, for example, has shown over Grenfell shows and demonstrates, you know, how, you know, unions can make and do, you know, put policies together and highlight campaigns and give the ability for those campaigns to get more press coverage. And I think, you know, from a trade union movement, I mean, I used to be asked a question, you know, what was the most important thing if there was a choice of a piece of legislation that you think would be the most beneficial? My answer to that, which surprised everybody because they expected me to talk about workplaces, was the right to a decent home. Mm. And again, you know, I would stress the right to a decent home and the right to live with dignity should be an expectation in the fifth richest economy in the world. And I would say, you know, that whatever we can do to assist the campaign, whatever we can do to assist any of our members or those who come into contact with us, we will be more than happy to support. So obviously we wish the campaign very well. We are ready to assist in any way possible. And obviously I wish you good luck for this evening.
Thank you, Ian. Really inspiring. Can people hear me clearly? really inspiring, and it's absolutely heartwarming to hear, yet again, the role of the trade unions in supporting issues around housing. I certainly do remember actually the magnificent support from not just the FBU, but from a range of other unions in the wake of Grenfell. So our next speaker is a tenant from North London. So if I could bring her in.
Can you hear me there?
Yes.
It's a he too.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
No problem.
Welcome.
So thanks for the chance to tell this story, which has taken place while I'm on furlough and
Are
hasn't been moved to.
you on audio only?
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
We introduce
Okay,
yourself.
so I moved. I was just asked to just tell the tale of what I've been experiencing, and so I moved into a rental property after signing a lodger agreement with a lady who's nearly 90 years old. I'll refer to her as Lucy just to keep her anonymous, and she has a rental agreement with the property owners. To give some context, Lucy's lived in this house for over 50 years. She originally owned the place with her husband, and they raised children here. Now, sadly, Lucy's husband passed away about 25 years ago. She's remained at the property after his passing, but eventually she was unable to pay debts and was forced to sell. Now, in the years after selling, she stayed at the property as a tenant and took on lodgers. Lucy's a real regular fixture in the local community. She's friendly, she's charming, she's incredibly independent for someone her age. She chats with everyone, she will help anyone. So, for example, there's a family upstairs here, and they leave their wheelchair with us, so it's easier for their disabled son to get access to it when they need to leave and take him somewhere. Now, in early August, Lucy received a phone call from the owner of the property. I don't know all the details, but the owner's son emailed me and the other lodger an hour later, requesting that we move out of the property in a month. He said he'd told Lucy to move out too. Now, apparently he'd given her notice and told her lodgers to move out without giving her any time to seek advice or have further input. Now, this seemed very strange because the owner had earlier told me he had no legal relationship with myself and my contract was with Lucy. Furthermore, Lucy's contract requires 2 months written notice and mine required 6 weeks written notice. Now, nonetheless, the other lodger moved out in a few weeks in line with this request. Now, during this time, I asked Lucy if she was moving out, what she was doing, and tried to understand her situation. She said she wasn't really sure and that the conversation with the owner had been a bit confusing. She didn't really recall the details. On multiple occasions, I gently suggested she contact the owners to get clarity, but she didn't do it. And eventually it became clear she wasn't really making plans. So I contacted Citizens Advice with Lucy there to tell her story. We were advised that Lucy should request written notice and that I was also entitled to 6 weeks notice as per our contracts. We were given another number to call for more advice, but every time we called, it took minutes to get through menus, and then an automated voice told us there was no one there to take our call and to try again later. We probably tried something like 100 times, but never managed to speak to anyone. So running out of time, I sent an email to the owner to ask that if he could follow the contractual requirements as suggested by Citizens Advice. Unfortunately, his response was aggressive and just downright bullying. In addition to insulting me, he threatened to take action to pursue me for costs if I did not move out. And a few days later, we received a delivery containing notice that Lucy had an accumulating debt and that the owner would seek court permission to evict her. The owner also emailed me and told me to leave within 8 days or face legal consequences and expenses. Incredibly, the owner was claiming that Lucy's accumulating debt included rent owed by the other lodger. This is the lodger who moved out in line with the owner's request to do so. Trying to placate the situation somewhat, I gave 6 weeks notice myself, meeting my contractual obligations, but the owner responded with more hostility and suggested I was playing clever games and that I was going to find out I wasn't so clever. We've been advised to stay put and to move out after receiving a court order, hopefully giving Lucy time to find somewhere to go and to pack up her life. Now, it's a pretty big task for her, and I'm not sure she fully comprehends how to manage it. On my side, to speak plainly, I'm pretty nervous. I'm pretty nervous that the owner will come to the property or take some action to intimidate or harm or harass. Every time I leave the house, I wonder if they'll be there when I return. And just today, I received an unsolicited text message with quotes for insurance products. Now, the owner has my details, and I asked myself, oh, could he be involved in this? I constantly have that sort of horrible feeling you get in your stomach, that feeling that only a bully can create. And I'm also very sad because it's very difficult to see such a nice lady being treated this way. After giving to her community for decades, you'd sort of think she'd be entitled to a few last years of peace. Thanks for listening. That's my story.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. It sounds quite harrowing, actually, and very stressful. Again, if any of the other speakers want to come back and respond to the person who's just spoken, please feel free. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who's coming all the way from the Bronx, New York, Anita Long, from CASA Community and Tenant Organization, where an eviction ban has been extended. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite. To all, my name is Anita Long, and I am a tenant leader with CASA. And CASA stands for Community Action for a Safe Apartment, and they're located in the Southwest Bronx in New York. I'm here to talk about the cancel rent bill that we are pushing. I just want to say that, because of COVID-19, and we are still being disrupted, and it's still ravaging our communities. Even though the data shows that the infectious rate and the related deaths have declined, COVID-19 is still cutting a jarring and unequal path across the state of New York, especially through housing stability. And because of COVID-19, our communities, the poor communities, were and are still forced to face economic hardship due to forced joblessness, forced cut in salaries, forced cuts in government resources, and the possibility of forced evictions leading to homelessness. We didn't ask for none of this. So I'm CASA is also part of a statewide coalition called Housing Justice for All. We understood that the decades of austerity, politics, and disinvestment within our community have made the economic fallout of COVID-19 even worse in our communities. Housing Justice for All Coalition, along with the New York City Right to Counsel, are fighting for three goals. One, cancel rent for tenants across the state of New York from the period of March 7th through the end of the COVID-19 crisis, ending when the state of emergency is no longer in effect. And after that, we're asking for 90 days. Number two, the universal eviction moratorium means no evictions for anyone during the duration of the state of an emergency. And when the state of the emergency is over, we're requesting another year after that. Three, because we have over 92,000 homeless people in the street, we're asking for the Housing Access Voucher Program that will give the homeless New Yorkers an immediate pathway out of the dangerous shelters, off the streets, and out of temporary hotel rooms because of the global pandemic. Our coalition believes that all rent, mortgages, and utility payments occurred during COVID-19 should be automatically forgiven and never owed. While an eviction moratorium is critical during this crisis, it does not prevent evictions or displacement in the future. So we believe a strong cancel rent policy must apply universally to everyone, including manufactured homeowners, those who live in single family homes, subletters, or roommates. The key components to the cancel rent is that canceling rent is universal and not subject to tenant providing proof or documentation of loss of income. We didn't ask to lose our jobs. There will be no transfer of funds or need to apply if it's a universal cancellation of rent. This must last for a minimum of 90 days after the state of emergency. Full and automatic forgiveness of all utilities, including electricity, gas, water, sewage, or internet for the duration of the crisis. No late fees, no surcharges, price gouging to collect higher rates, or arrears may be sent to or collected by debt collection agencies. To protect the renters long term, all forms of rent hikes must be disallowed. All tenants must have the right to renew their lease during this crisis. The problem that we've seen is that because of job loss, tenants are not able to pay their rent. But whenever the eviction moratorium is up, then the tenant is still responsible for the back rent. And if they have no job, how can they pay that? Then that will increase the homeless population. And this is what we're trying to avoid. And this is why we're saying cancel rent for everyone. How we're fighting this is like all this summer, we've been fighting with our governor, our state governor, Cuomo. We've been fighting with housing courts and the legislatures for our COVID-19 housing platform. We've been fighting them online in the virtual town halls. We've been showing up in front of our elected officials' offices. We've been doing it in our tenant organized buildings, doing rent strikes, and in front of housing courts, demanding to keep housing courts closed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. I'm really sorry about that. We had some issues with the in and out of the reception and your internet, but I think they're extraordinarily concrete demands, very, very powerful, and I hope that actually they inspire those of us in this campaign. Can I encourage people to ask questions? Maybe before I go on to the next speaker, I'll just read out one comment from Pauline Gibbons, who says that every flat or house that comes onto the market gets snapped up by a cash buyer, an investor, who then charges extortionate rents. It's impossible for young people to buy a home to get affordable rental. There's also a question from Morag Gilly, who it's a question for Anita. It says, whilst we all want a Trump defeat, I have no faith in Biden. Are CASA and other grassroots organizations mobilizing and building members or activists during this election period? And thank you for a brilliant speech. That's Morag. So yes, and a comment from Southwark Defence Council Housing, who say that it's great to hear about rent strikes and actions in New York. And thank you very much, Anita. So I go on, Anita.
No, the internet is like going in and out. So I didn't know if you had a question for me or you was just making a statement.
there was a question from Morag. She said, shall I read it again? Can you hear me, Anita?
I can hear you.
I'll try and increase my volume so perhaps it's better. There's a question. Your question is, can you hear me now?
Go ahead.
Whilst we all want a Trump defeat, this is from Morag.
Yeah, Trump to be defeated. Yes.
She says, I have no faith in Biden. Then she asks, are CASA and other grassroots mobilizing and building members and activists during this election period?
Yes, we are organizing. Some of our grassroots or coalitions, because of the 501c title, they're not allowed to get into politics. Just some of them are. So we do a lot of it on our personal time. The only thing that what we see is that our state is like they're doing barely anything because they're waiting on the federal government to do something. And the federal government, that's Trump, the only thing they did is, and we feel that it's a political move, you had the CDC to give a moratorium of eviction, but it doesn't cover everybody. Mm-hmm. And it does not put a pause on the tenant's debt. And that's what we're concerned about. Because once everything is over, we go back to whatever they say the normalcy is, a lot of people cannot pay back that debt that they did not ask for. But one thing with the CDC, by them creating eviction moratorium, is what they did was acknowledged that housing is health.
Okay, thank you very much, Anita. That's explained quite a lot, and I think it's certainly a question that I would be interested in a way of thinking about how we here in Britain can organise rent strikes, because I think it's something that people are really quite fearful about because they fear eviction. So if I could ask any of the speakers if they wanted to come back or make comment on the tenant who spoke earlier, or just some feedback on that.
It's 19 hours.
Anyone want to make comment on perhaps some advice or feedback? No? Okay, if there's no other questions, please feel free, people, to put in the questions. I think that actually on a personal level, I feel that it's actually quite terrifying in a way to think about what we're going to possibly face if they do lift the eviction ban. And I mean, I say this as a South African who grew up with extraordinary levels of homelessness and informal settlements, and just real extraordinary poverty around and danger around homes. And I think we sometimes think that that's not necessarily what we're likely to face here in Britain, because, as I think Ian said, the 5th richest country in the world. But, who thought that Grenfell would happen in the 5th richest country in the world? So please, can I encourage people to ask questions, make comments, talk about what is happening in your area, and I'll put those questions to the speakers. There is a question before I bring in the the next speaker. The question from Debbie Humphrey, who says, can Renters Union or Generation Rent give advice to the tenant who spoke?
Oh, hi, Moyra. Hi, Alicia from Generation Rent. Thanks for that, Debbie. It's hard to give advice without seeing the contract. The advice I would give to the tenant who spoke and to Lucy, the story of which was extremely tragic, is stay put. You cannot be evicted without a possession order. And, you know, we hear this all the time at Generation Rent with some landlords are great, right? And they've given, you know, rent off and they've negotiated deals, but some are just aggressive. They do send texts, they do send threatening letters, and we do get those reports from tenants. We're not an advice service. So we do tell them to seek legal advice and do what you did do, which was go to Citizens Advice. But we do say that you should stay put because you cannot be evicted without a possession order. But of course, when the courts reopen on Monday, which is why we're all here tonight, of course, that means that that eviction comes one step closer to many, many thousands of renters across the country. And which is why we're all here to ensure that the government does step in. But there are ways that they have to give you a proper written set of legal documents to start the eviction process. There are new procedures in place, which mean they have to now, even with the courts reopening on Sunday, and you can check this with the Citizens Advice, state that the landlord should give information to the judge about your COVID situation. Otherwise, the judge can adjourn that court case. Now, again, it's not a solution, it's a sticking plaster, but it does give people like you and Lucy more time. But it's a tragic situation. We hear it all the time. And that's why I was so keen to be part of this event tonight, because we do all need to join together to do as much as we can to try and make the government change their mind in the last few days before the eviction ban is lifted. And of course, that's what they did last time. So maybe together we can make sure they do it again. Debbie's also just come in about can the council make you yourself deliberately homeless who choose to leave to be evicted? I mean, one thing I would say to those, to Lucia and the tenant that spoke, is they should contact the council. I think you said, Moyra, they're in North London. I'm unsure now. And they should contact their local member of parliament, you know, as a matter of urgency if you haven't already, because the council does have an enforcement role. They can give advice. They can deal with the tenant. They can deal with aggressive behaviour and rogue landlords and those issues. So, you know, as I say, we're not an advice service, but stay put, seek advice from your member of parliament, the council, and as you have the Citizens Advice.
Thank you very much, Alicia. I'm going to read out just one more question before I bring in the next speaker. It's a comment from Haringey Defence Council Housing. It says, Theresa May promised to end Section 21 when she was Prime Minister. This was not some strange, sudden episode of good conscience. Instead, she was responding to struggles for housing justice over many years. Johnson put the pledge to end Section 21 into the Tory manifesto for the December 2019 general election. Now we have to get campaigning again to get the Tories to deliver on their promise. No to evictions, no to homelessness. And that's a fantastic contribution from Haringey Defence Council Housing. Thank you. Can I welcome our next speaker, who's Suzanne Mooner, from the Unite Housing Workers branch, and who represents staff in several housing associations. Suzanne is also a representative of the Social Action Housing Campaign, SHAC. Thank you, Suzanne. Someone unmute Suzanne.
She has to do it herself.
Suzanne, could you unmute yourself? Great. Thank you. You okay there, Suzanne?
Thank you, Moyra. And apologies if my sound isn't very good today. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Well, I can.
Yeah, it should
You
be
are
unmuted now.
We can hear you.
Can you
yes,
hear me?
We can. Well, I can hear you. Yes, we can, Suzanne. Keep going, Suzanne. Suzanne.
I think Suzanne's gone.
Okay. Okay, I will perhaps ask to bring in the next speaker while Suzanne sorts out some of her technical difficulties. Before I bring in the next speaker, I just want to read out another comment, which is from Truths, who says, please can we suggest a partial rent strike as an option too in case of rent increases? It worked for us and people feel okay with that. So hopefully that's something that the speakers can come back on. So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, who is Solma Ahmed from Momentum, who's worked with housing in housing for decades. Welcome, Solma. Hello.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, my line is really bad. I keep getting cut off. Thank you for inviting me. I was told to cover BME COVID death and talk about briefly the Momentum housing campaign. As you've said, I've worked in housing all my life, starting from working in Tower Hamlets for a homeless project back in the 80s. I have seen firsthand the devastation of bad housing on people's health, particularly on BME communities. I have always said housing, health, and employment are linked, and there is no question after COVID-19. So when COVID took over our lives since March, the death of BME communities in the beginning did not surprise me, but the sheer number did, because if we look at our population, 14% of our population are from BME communities from 2011 census. The COVID patients, third of COVID patients were from BME communities. The death rate was 2.5 times more than whites. I have lost number of family and friends during this COVID period from here to New York to Bangladesh as well. The first death that took place was one of my family friend who was only 57 years old. Then I began to hear more and more of my relatives and friends in hospital or just dying. And at one time I was really scared to answer phones. So I had a number of family friends also working in care homes, and they are primarily women. And because, due to lack of education and training, they worked in frontline mostly. Several of them told me that they did not have PPE or very little PPE. And one of my relatives were told that she can't change her gloves during the day. So I had so many stories like that of conditions at work in the beginning of the COVID that started. We all know about what happened to PPE history. So the first 106 BME patients that died, 63% were from BME communities. Then there is mental health issue. I would just like to touch briefly on mental health issue, because staying in 2-bedroom high-rise flats, 2 of my sister-in-laws were petrified of going out or getting into the lifts. Their kids did the necessary shopping. Even after lockdown lifted, they did not go out for 5 months because they were scared, although two sisters live only 5 minutes apart in Poplar. So after 5 months, I sort of had to drag them out of their flats and come into my house where I live outside of London. I felt guilty that I had garden, but grateful that I had garden during the COVID time. But this is how it was like for most of BME communities who lived in council blocks in all over UK. I think I just like to touch on what Omar Khan from Runnymede Trust said, and that sort of puts into context, what's been happening. And that is, racism is a matter of life and death. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, racial inequalities in health, education, housing, and employment have shaped the lives of BME groups from cradle to grave. And I really believe that statement to be true. All of this, of course, breaks my heart. And I feel really let down by the system after working in housing and addressing race equality issues all my life. So what people like me do to improve things? And you, I suppose, we carry on our struggle. As a recently elected Momentum NCG member, we are leading on a housing eviction campaign. Because, everyone deserves somewhere to live. What kind of a country we are if we can't provide the basic necessity like a roof over people's head? It's shameful what is happening right now. We are living in a crisis. As estimated, 227,000 private renters are falling into rent arrears during the pandemic, and about 60,000 notices already have been issued. If we do nothing, this eviction will decimate our communities. And a lot of BME communities live in private rented housing, not only social housing. That's why Momentum is launching a campaign to fight back against the tsunami of eviction. Alongside Renters Union like Union, Acorn, and London Renters Unit, we will be building a movement to force landlords' profit to take a back seat. As well as taking on the Tories, we are also going to push Labour opposition. Our campaign fights for 3 transformative reforms, and most of them have been already mentioned. 1, extend the eviction ban in England and Wales for at least a year until August 2021. Legislate to force landlord to write off the rent or forgive the rent arrears that accumulated during the pandemic. Following through the Section 21 notice that Conservative government have agreed, we will fight to make that a reality. So our campaign is going to be launched formally on Monday, and 22nd of September, Tuesday, we are holding a housing campaign organizing Zoom call where we will get people to sign up to the campaign. Thank you very much. I hope you could hear me and see me because the line is terrible.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think we certainly can. They were just brief moments where we couldn't hear you, Solma, but that was absolutely brilliant and so pertinent, the question of racism and housing. Suzanne, hopefully Suzanne will be able to come back and has been able to talk up. Brilliant. Welcome,
Thank
Suzanne.
You. Thank you. Thanks, Moyra, and thanks everyone for your patience. And thanks to Home for All for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm on the committee of the Unite Housing Workers branch and also its sister organisation, the Social Housing Action Campaign, and speaking specifically on the housing association sector rather. Housing associations own about 3 million homes in Britain and employ around 150,000 workers. They're extremely wealthy, and their size and wealth inevitably give them enormous power over the lives of those who work for them and those who live in their properties. And it's important to recognise that housing associations no longer just provide home for rents, but increasingly supply for the open market, for sale and for rent. Unite's Housing Workers branch members realised about 4 years ago that we had considerable common cause with tenants and residents. We have a common enemy in the increasingly commercialised, market-driven, development-dominated boards and executives of housing associations. So we realised that to win, we would have to create a united front. Ultimately, we may even one day have an industrial strike and a rent strike at the same housing association. That's one of our aims. That's why we set up our own community campaign called Shack. We've come together because we're angry about the housing crisis, we're angry about the shabby treatment of workers, and we're angry that in the current brutal climate, only one of 2,000 plus housing associations has taken the decision to cease evictions for the foreseeable future. Shockingly, over the last few years, despite a collective surplus of around £4 billion and their supposedly charitable aims, housing associations have been the sector with the highest records of any category of landlord on eviction proceedings. Even before the pandemic, more than half of all evictions were from social landlords, and more than half of social landlords are housing associations. This was why we were proud to stand alongside other housing campaigns against lifting the eviction ban at the end of August, and to have played our part in forcing government into yet another retreat. It's also why we're supporting Unite Community's call for a Twitter storm at 3 p.m. tomorrow with its 3 demands of no evictions, help those in arrears, and build council houses. You can see the full details on the news blog on www.shackaction.org, and I'll put that into the chat facility. But while the eviction ban extension and especially the extended notice period have brought some valuable extra time, the campaign cannot stop there. Other speakers have spoken with great emotion about why that is. We support the call against lifting the eviction ban, and we are ready and prepared for eviction resistance, preventing bailiffs gaining access to properties. But beyond that, our activists want nothing short of an end to the tyranny of housing association executives. At the heart of the problem is a fundamental lack of democratic control by workers and tenants. The biggest of the housing associations are too big to fail, and their executives at the moment consider themselves beyond accountability. But we've shown that using trade union principles of collective action, it's possible to take on these giants and win. We don't want concessions, we don't want handouts, and we don't want charity. What we want is a rebalancing of power so that as workers and as tenants, we can influence decision making, not through association-controlled staff councils or scrutiny panels, but through elected accountable representatives. With this, repairs and maintenance services would improve. Rent and service charges would reflect real costs, and in a crisis like the current pandemic, rents and service charges could be waived instead of adding to a growing, overwhelming debt mountain. Health and safety would be addressed so that no one had to fear incineration, because people who didn't have to live with the consequences decided to wrap cheap, flammable materials around their buildings. And finally, the hyper-exploitation of housing workers will be brought to a full stop. Then we could look at transferring estates back under council control where tenants wanted it, and towards solving the housing crisis through mass council house building. These are just some of the measures that Shack and the Unite Housing Workers branch call for, and we will keep fighting for them. We invite everyone here with a housing association landlord or employer to join us in the fight and to help us win. In the meantime, thanks again for inviting me, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion and answering any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. I'm a housing association tenant, and I certainly concur with everything you say, and you've identified so many of the issues that I think Homes for All Defence Council Housing has been campaigning around for a number of years, and so have a lot of other organisations. And I certainly look forward to us all coming together at, in this particular period to, stop the eviction ban. Can I encourage people? I know we're almost halfway or three-quarters of the way through our meeting, can I encourage people who are watching to try and share it on their Facebook, so that there are people who perhaps can come in later or may actually be able to watch it if they're in the middle of their dinner. I'd like to actually welcome someone who has supported lots of the housing campaigns. It's John McDonnell, the MP. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Moyra. Thanks for inviting me along as well. And it's an honour to be on this panel. Look at the range of people that you have with Alicia, Ian, and Anita, and others. All have been working hard. Can I just pay tribute to? There's so many people who've been campaigning hard on this housing issue and providing us with so much support. I'd like to thank them. There's lots of, excuse me, there's lots of hidden heroes as well. And I just want to mention one, and she'll be deeply embarrassed. And that's Liz Davis, the housing solicitor, who for the years have been helping us in terms of giving individual legal advice, but also in helping us craft some of the legal demands that we're placing on government and others. Let me just explain, we all come to this from our own personal experiences, but let me just say, and others can say what's happening in their area, but in my area, you know, I represent Hayes and Harlington. I've lived here over 40 years now, nearly 50, and it's a working class community on the edge of London, Heathrow. And we're having massive layoffs. Some of you will know British Airways firing, rehiring, the Unite really fighting a battle to protect the members, Heathrow Airport, and then all the other little firms. People are being sacked at the moment, losing their jobs. And many of them now are really, really hard up against it, both in terms of they've been on furlough, so their wages have been cut, lots of them being sacked, and now also this fire and rehire strategy where you sack people, take them back on, but you cut their wages. So I'm having lots of constituents now who are getting to real problems financially, not being able to pay their rent or even their mortgages. And it's a real worry. And I tell you, we've got a COVID epidemic at the moment. I think we're creating a mental health epidemic as well because of the stress that people are under. But, you know, what we've got to do is just keep at it. And the point that Alicia made is the reason we're here tonight is because the eviction ban gets lifted next week. Now, way back when we first were negotiating with government at the beginning of this pandemic, we said to them we need an evictions ban. And as a result of lots of people on this call, as a result of the campaigning of the organisations here represented here and elsewhere, we did get that eviction ban. But this government always acts in a panic, always leaves it to the last minute. And that's what they did in August. It was literally days before we actually got the announcement that the eviction ban would be extended to next week, but it's here again. Now we know they've moved in terms of giving 6 months notice and introducing that, but it still means all those cases, as others have said, that are in the pipeline will be resumed. So we've got to call upon this government and say we need a proper evictions ban. I agree with Momentum. It's at least a year because we've seen it tragically, this COVID crisis, it's come back again. The numbers of cases is going up, 3,000 yesterday, 4,000 today, and the deaths are increasing as well. And the lockdowns are being extended too. So people are as affected now as they were back in March and April and May. So we need the evictions ban extended at least a year. That's the first thing. And for those that are in the pipeline now, I think it is a matter of supporting them all we possibly can with legal advice and whatever. But I think, yes, resistance if necessary. And, in my constituency in the past, when we've had evictions through rogue landlords, we have turned up at the house to prevent the family being evicted. And if we have to do that again, we will mobilise. The other issue as well is, during this period, people have referred to it. Theresa May, Boris Johnson, they gave us a commitment that they would scrap Section 21. They've had enough time. They should do it now. And, I tell you, Alicia is a member of the House of Lords. I tell you, we would get a majority in the House of Commons and the House of Lords to do this if the government brought it forward. And we could do it swiftly as well. but they need to commit to that promise. The other issue as well, I agree, there's a lot of people who've got a lot of debts at the moment. And you know, the government introduced financial support for a whole range of businesses. A lot of small businesses got £15,000 grants. Others got significant loans and support. So again, I think what we need to do is say to the government, we need those people who, as a result of the crisis that they're going through now, the loss of income, the loss of their jobs, the cuts in wages and the poor level of benefits, they need financial support to lift them out of this debt, because that debt is causing the stress that's causing such mental health problems. Can I also say as well, there's big issues that have been thrown up by this crisis and this whole issue around housing, and it has thrown open, I think, a real debate now about landlordism. I think what we should do now is think about what role landlordism plays in our society. And I don't think, my own personal view is, I don't think housing should be something that you make profits out of. I think housing should be a basic right. And therefore, if there are to be landlords, I think we should restrict the number of properties that they have. If there's small scale landlords, fair enough, but I don't see why there should be huge landlords making profits on the scale that they do. And I also believe that actually the problem that we have with some of the social landlords and the scale of properties that they manage, they're operating like big businesses. As we've heard, you know, social landlords has been as bad as some private landlords in terms of the threats of evictions. And we've got to make sure we introduce democratic control of those organizations. And finally, let me just say this. I think now that this whole issue of COVID has hit us again now, you know, at the beginning of this crisis, when the government said we will take people off the streets and house them, we thanked them for it and we congratulated them for it. The onus fell on local authorities, a hard stretch. They haven't been financially supported, and that's appalling. The government needs to do something about that. But those people are now reappearing on our streets, and we're now going into winter. If we could house them back in May, we should be able to house them again. I think we should ensure that this government now recognises its responsibilities to take everybody off the streets. And then we need to develop a proper strategy of building council homes to make sure that we have the housing supply that we need. This is the time to do it. And, I think people support that now. I think the one thing that's come out of this COVID crisis is people have looked at what we value in life. And one thing that's come out of it is actually people realize, actually, we do care for one another and we do need one another. And therefore, we call upon the government now to, yes, extend that evictions ban, scrap Section 21, tackle the issue of debts that people have incurred and give them the financial support they need. But start now and make sure people are not sleeping on our streets this winter, but start now to start building social housing again, council housing, because that's what we need.
Thank you very much, John. Certainly, it was obvious to a lot of us that actually, if the government could so swiftly take people off the streets during COVID, that it is possible for everyone to be housed. Before I take the last speaker, can I remind people that actually in the chat there is there's details about how we can actually take part in a Twitter storm. So please, can people have a look at it and copy that information. Before I ask the last speaker to speak, I'm going to also put to the panel a couple of questions, which hopefully you can come back to at the end after the last speaker, where I will be asking all of the speakers to very quickly just come back for a minute or two. So there's a couple of questions that have come through, which is, what can we do next collectively to stop COVID-19 evictions? And the second question is, how come CASA and the New York tenants can win? What can we learn from them? So those are the questions hopefully our speakers can think about. I'd like to welcome our final speaker, who is Lord Bird of Big Issue. hopefully he's here tonight, which is a magazine of and by homeless people and much, much more. Is Lord Bird here? Or John Bird? Is he here? Not sure.
I don't think he is.
I don't think he is. Okay. In which case, if I could ask the speakers, going back to I'll take it in reverse order. Or is that reverse order? If I start again from Alicia, if you could come back for a minute.
Yeah, thanks, Moyra. I mean, I couldn't agree more with John and the other speakers. I mean, there was a demonstration on Wednesday, which I participated in, and thanks for Homes for All for organising it. I think that needs to be repeated. I think the current crisis demands that private renters tell the story like the tenant did today. Politicians, people and policymakers need to hear the impact of the policies of the government and the impact they're having on people's lives. We did a roundtable with renters this week where renters were able to put their story directly to a member of parliament, which was very useful. We are collecting case studies through Vent Your Rent website. It is Vent Your Rent, the URL. So go there and let us know, because we really, it brings to life the tragedy and the debt and the issues and the mental health, as John said, the anxiety, the worry, that people are going through. It's absolutely tragic. And when we use that information to talk to members of parliament and members of the House of Lords, it's very, very powerful. So as well as the direct action that I do think is needed, the personal testimony that brings to life the tragedy of people's lives at the minute because they've struggled to rent debt is really helpful and useful to an organisation like Generation Rent. Some people want to be anonymous, and that's fine. Other people want to be on the media, and that's equally fine. We've had a woman called Nicola, who had a Section 21 notice. She was on the ITV News in the run-up to the last ban, and it helps shape the public debate. It helps put pressure and bring the stories to life for the journalists as much as for the politicians. So it's really useful that we hear your stories where we can. So lobby your MPs individually. I think, as John said, your councillors. We spoke to a few councillors recently who said that they rarely get contacted by private tenants. And I think that's because that they don't necessarily see the council as a vehicle for change to help them, but they are. They have a key enforcement role. So don't leave out GLA members that are obviously coming up for election, the London Mayor who's coming up for election, and many councillors across the country are up for election next year. They need to hear your stories and how your life's been affected by the current government policy. So I would say, get lobbying, let's get together. And if you can tell us your story, then please do, because we're very adept at campaigning with it and making sure that organisations like Homes for All, we share that information and we work together to make sure your story is heard by the people that can make a difference.
Suggestions. Can I ask for Ian? If you could come back in just a minute.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's been a very informative meeting, and obviously, I take a lot of the stuff that a lot of the speakers have said, and obviously the personal story before was a tragedy, but unfortunately, not unique. I mean, there's far too many people with tragic stories, and I don't know how many more tragic stories we're going to have to hear before we actually do something about it, because quite clearly politicians who have the power to be able to do something about it over the decades have chosen not to. They've not exercised their ability to make decisions that benefit people. They've made decisions that benefit a few for certain, but that's always been at the expense of the many. And I think that as we go through this crisis, with this end of furlough coming on top of the debts that people have mounted up, with the loss of jobs that's coming. I mean, this week, we've been informed of the situation in relation to Greggs. Greggs was a decent employer, is a decent employer, and during furlough, it made a decision it couldn't keep its people safe, so it did them at home, put them on 100% pay, and obviously return people back to work, but only in a safe manner. But now, obviously, faced with a 65 million loss, they're looking at a decision, because obviously the government hasn't decided to extend the furlough scheme to make so many people at risk of losing their job. And I think when you see what's coming down the line, and the total inability of the government to deal with the crisis, you can only worry. And I do think it is going to take direct action. I think it is going to be us working collectively to support one another to ensure that people don't end up on the streets. And John's absolutely right. At the beginning of this crisis, demonstrates, like I said before, it is a political choice. And what we have to do as a people is make sure that political choice is answered with the people's response, which is to say, we're not going to let you do this anymore.
Thank you, Ian. I think that's really what a lot of us need to hear. Can I ask for Anita, if you could come back? I think there was a couple of questions directed at you.
Yes.
Go on, Anita.
Okay. I thank you again for inviting me. It was great hearing all of the speakers that was on this stage. I would have to say that we have to continue to stand up and fight, and do not be afraid. Do not think that what we're asking is too ambitious or it's too much. Our lives are at stake. If we have our government, I know in the United States, who doesn't have a problem bailing out large corporations like the banks and the airlines and the cruise lines, but they don't want to bail out the people, their constituents. There is a problem. When we say that, and here when we're fighting at all levels, like I said, we're doing it on the virtual town halls. We're using a lot of the social media. We're showing up at the housing courts to make sure that they keep the housing courts closed, and because of COVID-19, and to make sure that not one tenant get evicted. And not only are we showing up at the housing court, but we're showing up at the landlords' law firms, their lawyers, and protesting in front of them to let them know we see you. So there is a lot of work that we have to do. Like they said, is another phase 2 coming in for COVID. That's going to get even worse. When I say that we have 92,000 homeless people in the streets, and if you allow the evictions, that number only increases, right? And then you'll have empty apartments because no one has jobs to pay for the rent. That's why we're pushing real hard for the cancel rent, to make sure that every tenant, no matter what you rent, is protected, and that debt does not come back to you. Because once they lift the state of emergency, a lot of people, a lot of families have to start off over again as far as getting new jobs in order for them to start paying rent. But I think I believe the cancel rent is very, very important. The universal eviction moratorium is very important to make sure that no one, regardless, is evicted during this crisis and 1 year after the crisis has ended. I think it's very important that we start housing the homeless properly. Right now, because of the crisis, we're throwing them in shelters, not only in shelters, but into hotel rooms, when we should be spending the money to build supportive housing for them and to make sure that they're safe and that they will always have a roof over their head. We just have a lot of work to do.
Thank you so much, Anita. I think you've given all of us a lot of food for thought and certainly a lot of inspiration that we can actually take and build on. Thank you. I know that Solma has had to leave, so I'm going to ask Suzanne if she's got anything to come back with.
Yeah, I think you know, it's a very good question. How do we organise? And you know, I'm sure we've all shared the frustrations of trying to organise and trying to bring people together, and it is very difficult, particularly when you can't use the traditional methods, which is to go out and leaflet and do things like that, and people aren't gathering. I think ultimately, as well as all of the methods that have been outlined by people today, I think ultimately we will have to hit landlords, particularly when, you know, I know my sector, which is the housing association sector, we'll have to hit them economically really to get them to take notice, just as sometimes we have to take strike action to get them to get ourselves noticed as employees in our workplaces and to really make management take us seriously. The difficulty we have, I mean, obviously that's not an easy tactic, and we would definitely take legal advice before doing it, and we would put the money, instead of just not paying it, the money has to go into a separate pot so that you can show you're willing to pay it, but it is contingent on certain demands. But I think we are very inspired by looking at what happened in, for example, if you watch the film about the Spanish resistance to evictions, CC Pueda, and the way that they organised there. We look across to Ireland, the way that they organised there. But in Britain, we had one specific example, which was one housing group tenants in East London who did an absolutely brilliant job of organising when their landlord, one housing group, was trying to put up rents by as much as 25% in some cases for key workers. They did exactly that. They refused to pay the increase, and they put the increase into a separate pot and made sure that it wasn't accessible to the landlord. And this was after a long time of sort of campaigning and building for it. It was when they took that step, almost overnight, the landlord cancelled the increase, and in some cases even reduced the rents for some of the people from even to lower what they were before they actually took the rent strike. It's an incredibly powerful tool, and it really does get them to take notice. The difficulty obviously is always going to be that it's very hard to organise people. So what I would say is, if you know private tenants, encourage them to join private tenant unions for private renters. If they're housing associations, bring them to SHAC and to other organisations that are working with housing associations. Because really it is about being able to bring people together and to get them, you know, because it's that sense of isolation that really, really gives our employers and our landlords a lot of power over us. It's when we're united, and they understand that, so they do everything that they can to divide us in one way or another. So the more that we can bring people together and get access to each other and able to contact each other, the more likely we are to succeed in any of these tactics.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Can I thank everybody for actually joining us in this excellent meeting? And before I bring in our last speaker, I'm going to actually remind people also that the fight for justice for Grenfell is nowhere near actually taking any steps to achieving anything. We still have the issues of cladding. I think, as everybody aware, still over 350 buildings across the country, and ministers prevaricating as usual. And, you know, we've had that disgusting vote in the House of Commons the other night, in which the Conservatives voted down the Labour Party amendment. And, you know, it's caused enormous anger and pain for the communities, the bereaved families, the survivors around Grenfell. So we hope that people can join us. Every Monday we're still outside the inquiry, making our voices heard, where the corporates are quite stunningly, shockingly, giving evidence that is quite breathless in the careless nature in which they treated the refurbishment of Grenfell. So thank you, everybody. And can I just call John McDonnell to finish this great meeting? Thanks, John.
Thanks, Moyra. Ironically, I'm now going on to a meeting with my constituents on Zoom about cladding of the high-rise blocks in my constituency. And they feel fearful, and they're also anxious about the lack of government action. And you're right, I thought it was despicable the other night, despicable that we take the recommendations that we know need to be implemented to keep people safe, and the Conservatives voted against. Even I was shocked. I don't have an awful good estimation of what the Tories are like at the moment, but even I was shocked that they would do that. Yeah, so I'm going on to meet some very worried constituents, to be honest. Just very briefly then, to my own view is exactly what has been said. I think Alicia is right. These personal stories do have their effect. And I think some of the media are now interested in this in a way they've not been before. But remember, 40% of people get their information through social media and the internet. So I think we should flood the internet now with stories, case stories, anonymized if necessary, of just what's happening. But Ian's right as well. We've got, if necessary, if it takes direct action, I'm sorry, we've got to do it because this is too important. This is people's homes and lives are at risk. And I think if necessary, we've got to be out there. And I also think, I was saying with Suzanne about that link between tenants and the union representatives, the unions who represent the workers in the housing field. I think that's absolutely critical. And that I think is really innovative in a way that we've tried hard to do, and it's now happening. As a result, I think some terrific work by trade unions, as well as the Renters Union and ACORN. But I just want to say this as well. I thought Anita was inspiring, and I'm really grateful that she joined us tonight because I think she's given us a lot of confidence. But I just want to say this. We've got to make it absolutely clear when the government try to give the impression these things can't be done, yes, they can. And they're very simple. This is not rocket science. All that has to happen first on evictions is that on Monday, well, ideally Monday, a minister turns up in Parliament and announces the extension of the evictions ban for a year. Can be done overnight. That's the first thing. The second thing, on the scrapping of Section 21, we could get legislation through Parliament very quickly. You're not talking about month after month, you're talking about a matter of weeks, because I think there's a political will to do it on the Labour Party and amongst other political parties as well. So if the Tories said we'll do it, we could get it through. On financial support, we've got the budget coming up now. We should be lobbying Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, to include in their financial support for renters, to wipe out these debts that have been incurred. And if they say they can't afford it, look, this is completely financially and economically manageable. Of course, it means we've got to borrow money to see us through this crisis. That's what we're doing. But to be frank, interest rates are so low now. Now's the time to use that to borrow to ensure that we get through the crisis itself. But we lay the foundations with that money for a proper housing policy that tackles homelessness. And exactly as this campaign is called, provides homes for all. This is all doable. And what we've got to do now is, well, I'm afraid, kick up such a fuss that whoever's in government delivers on this. And I actually think the general public are with us because so many of them and their families are being affected. But it requires one thing, and I always say it, it requires solidarity. And what we've seen tonight is solidarity across a whole range of organizations and, yes, international solidarity. So we can get there. Solidarity.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you for all great speakers. Please, we're in the middle of COVID. Can we keep an eye on what we can do in terms of Twitter? There's lots of information in the chat, but also can we look at Homes for All Twitter and social media pages for any action and action of resistance that we can all take. So thank you, everybody, and please share this widely so that other people can watch it and we can all stay united and stick together and build a resistance. Thank you, everyone.
And thanks to you, Moyra.